In the summer of 1877, a shallow canyon on Lolo Creek in western Montana held a fort that never fired a shot in anger and never needed to. 35 soldiers and roughly 200 armed civilian volunteers dug rifle pits and stacked breastworks of logs and earth across a passage barely 200 yards wide, a place so narrow that a local saying held a goat could not slip past it. They were there to stop several hundred Nez Perce men, women, children, and elders, along with close to 2,000 horses, from entering the Bitterroot Valley. What happened instead is remembered today by the name the soldiers gave their own position afterward, a name that has outlived almost everything else about the encounter. They called it Fort Fizzle. The story of how it earned that name is well documented. What happened in the 11 days after the Nez Perce walked away from that canyon unopposed is documented too, but it is rarely told in the same breath, and the gap between those two facts is what this film is built around. This is western Montana, in the region now marketed to travelers as Glacier Country, a name that stretches from the peaks of Glacier National Park south through the Bitterroot Valley and the Lolo Trail the Nez Perce had used for generations before any forts stood in their way. The land remembers the passage differently than the official record of 1877 remembers it, and tonight we are looking at what the Nez Perce said, what the United States Army recorded, and what happened to the promise that stood between those two accounts. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Long before Lolo Creek had a fort or a nickname, it had a trail, and the trail had been in continuous use for longer than any American institution involved in this story had existed. The Nimiipuu, the people white settlers came to call the Nez Perce, crossed the Bitterroot Mountains along this route to reach the buffalo country of the plains, a seasonal migration that predated recorded American history by centuries. The trail climbed through dense timber and volcanic ridgelines, the core of discovery nearly starved crossing in 1805, and it was Nez Perce guidance, food, and horses that allowed Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to survive the passage at all. The tribe's relationship with that expedition is itself well recorded. What is less often placed beside it is the fact that by 1877, the same trail, the same mountains, and largely the same families were being treated by the federal government not as partners in a survival story, but as a population to be removed. The Nez Perce were not a single unified political body in the way 19th-century American negotiators often assumed. Several bands lived across a homeland spanning what is now Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, and by the 1860s, gold discoveries on their land had already forced a treaty that reduced their territory by nearly 90%. Some bands, including that of a young leader named Joseph, refused to sign or recognize the reduced boundaries. By the spring of 1877, the United States government had set a deadline for these non-treaty bands to relocate onto the smaller reservation or face military force. A young man's act of retaliatory violence in Idaho, following the killing of his father, escalated tensions past the point of negotiation. Within weeks, several bands, roughly 800 people including fewer than 200 fighting men, were in open flight from the United States Army, moving east across terrain few soldiers of the era knew as intimately as the people fleeing across it. By late July, that flight had carried them over Lolo Pass and down into Montana Territory, directly toward the canyon where Captain Charles Rawn and his hastily assembled force waited. What happened at Fort Fizzle is not disputed in its broad outline, though the details of exactly what was promised there remain contested to this day, and that contest is the center of the story. On the 25th of July, Rawn's men finished their breastworks. The following day, the Nez Perce leaders Lookingglass and Whitebird approached under a flag of truce, accompanied by an interpreter known as Delaware Jim, and told Rawn plainly that they intended no violence against the settlers of the Bitterroot Valley. They asked only to pass through. Rawn's orders from his superiors were explicit. He was to compel the Nez Perce to surrender their weapons, their ammunition, and their horses before any passage would be permitted. It was, functionally, a demand for surrender dressed as a condition of transit, and the Nez Perce leaders recognized it as such. According to the account later attributed to Chief Joseph, Rawn agreed during these negotiations that the Nez Perce could pass through the valley peacefully. Rawn himself never admitted to making any such agreement. What survives instead, on the American side of the ledger, is a different kind of concession. Lookingglass turned from the regular troops to the civilian volunteers standing alongside them and made them a direct promise. If the volunteers would step aside and let his people pass unmolested, no blood would be shed in the Bitterroot Valley. The offer was, in the words of one soldier's later account, one that the volunteers found disgraceful to accept and yet accepted anyway. A Bitterroot settler named John Martins recorded in his own account that the volunteers had expected an attack and instead found the Nez Perce had simply found a way around them and left them alone. On the 28th of July, that is exactly what happened. Rather than test the barricade directly, the Nez Perce climbed the steep, forested ridge above the canyon, moving their entire encampment, families, elders, and nearly 2,000 horses, over terrain the defenders had assumed no one would attempt. A few warriors fired down on the fort as a diversion. The rest simply walked past. Rawn's men exchanged a handful of shots and then abandoned their position to follow at a cautious distance. Not one person on either side had been killed. The fort that was built to stop an army had been rendered irrelevant by a decision to go over a ridge instead of through a canyon, and the name Fort Fizzle followed the site from that week onward. What followed the ridge crossing is the part of the story that the fort's nickname tends to obscure. The Nez Perce moved south into the Bitterroot Valley exactly as they had promised, without violence. They passed through the settlements at Stevensville and Corvallis, and rather than raiding for supplies, as an army fearing hostiles might have expected, they traded for them. Settlers sold flour, coffee, and other provisions directly to the same people their own militia had, only days earlier, been prepared to fire upon. 6 additional lodges of Nez Perce, who had been summering peacefully in the Bitterroot that season, under a leader known as Poker Joe, joined the main body during this stretch, swelling their numbers and providing fresh horses for the journey ahead. For a short stretch of days in the summer of 1877, the valley that had mobilized 200 armed men against the Nez Perce watched them pass through as customers rather than combatants. Contemporary accounts from Bitterroot residents describe a mood approaching relief, even a kind of reluctant welcome, entirely at odds with the military alarm that had summoned Rawn's volunteers in the first place. This is the piece of the record that deserves to be held up beside the fort's nickname, because it complicates the tidy story that the name implies. Fort Fizzle sounds like a joke, a footnote about a blockade that failed through incompetence. What it obscures is that the blockade did not fail because the Nez Perce forced their way through by violence. It failed because Lookingglass made a promise. The promise was tested immediately against real settlers with real property in an undefended valley, and the promise held. For 11 days, from the ridge crossing above Lolo Creek to the 9th of August, the Nez Perce kept their word to a valley that had been prepared to shoot them. The name of the institutional actor that ended those 11 days is a matter of clear record, not speculation. Colonel John Gibbon, commanding the 7th Infantry out of Fort Shaw, had been tracking the Nez Perce since their crossing into Montana, gathering troops as he went. General Oliver Otis Howard, whose own pursuit from Idaho had been slower and less direct, was still days behind. Gibbon caught up to the Nez Perce encampment at a place called the Big Hole, along the upper reaches of a river of the same name, on the far side of the Continental Divide, from the valley where they had traded peacefully only days before. The Nez Perce, believing themselves finally safe from pursuit now that they had crossed into what they understood as more distant country, had not posted a heavy guard. They had, by every account, kept their promise to the valley behind them and expected no further threat ahead of them. Before dawn on the 9th of August, Gibbon's men attacked the sleeping camp directly, without warning and without any attempt at negotiation of the kind that had taken place at Fort Fizzle less than 2 weeks earlier. The assault struck the camp's lodges directly, and the resulting fighting killed a number that most historians place between 60 and 90, Nez Perce, a majority of them women, children, and elders, alongside several dozen soldiers and volunteers in the counterattack that followed once the warriors organized a defense. The Battle of the Big Hole, as it came to be recorded in military histories, is remembered as a major engagement of what the same institutions came to call the Nez Perce War. it is remembered far less often as the direct sequel to a piece that had just been tested and kept 11 days earlier in a valley less than 100 miles away. That sequencing matters, and it is where the institutional shape of this story becomes visible. The record of Fort Fizzle survives largely because it ended without bloodshed, which made it safe to commemorate later as an amusing footnote, a fort that failed to fort. The record of the peaceful passage through the Bitterroot survives in scattered settler letters, in the recollections attributed to Chief Joseph, and in the work of later historians assembling the full campaign narrative, but it was never elevated to the same institutional prominence as the battles that followed it. The United States Army's own after-action reporting on the 1877 campaign and the popular military histories that drew from it in the following decades organized the story around engagements. Engagements required combat. A valley crossed without a fight, however remarkable the restraint it required from both sides, did not fit that organizing structure, and it was allowed to recede into local memory rather than national record. Captain Rawn's own post-war silence on whether he had promised safe passage is part of that same pattern. If he had made such a promise and it later held, admitting so would have meant admitting that the Army's demand for unconditional surrender at the barricade had been abandoned in practice, quietly, in a negotiation the official record preferred not to specify. It was simpler, institutionally, to let the fort's name carry the story. Fort Fizzle. A failure of engineering and preparation, not a failure of the very policy that sent Rawn there in the first place. The Bureau of Indian Affairs and the War Department shared an interest in a version of the flight that read as a hostile band evading capture, not as a people repeatedly offering peace to a country that kept answering with force after the fact. Big Hole did not need Fort Fizzle to be forgotten. It only needed the connection between the two events to go unexamined, and for close to a century and a half, it largely has. What survived outside that institutional frame did so because individuals outside the institutions chose to preserve it. Chief Joseph, in the years following his surrender at Bears Paw further east that same autumn, gave interviews and made a documented address in Washington in which he spoke of promises made and promises broken across the length of the flight, though the specific record of the Fort Fizzle negotiation rests on testimony attributed to him rather than an independent Army transcript. A more complete testimony came decades later and from an unlikely direction. A rancher and self-taught historian named Lucullus Virgil McWhorter spent years earning the trust of Nez Perce survivors of the 1877 flight. Among them, a warrior known as Yellow Wolf, who had fought at the Big Hole and carried the memory of that dawn attack for the rest of his life. McWhorter recorded Yellow Wolf's account directly from his own words over repeated visits and published it in 1940 as a full narrative of the campaign from the Nez Perce side, a perspective almost entirely absent from the military histories that had dominated the story for 60 years prior. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What Yellow Wolf described of the attack at the Big Hole was not strategy or politics. It was the specific, physical memory of a camp struck before light, of families separated in the chaos of gunfire in the dark, of a peace that had been kept faithfully in one valley being answered 11 days later with an assault in another. His account, preserved only because one outside historian took the trouble to sit with him and write it down, stands as the clearest surviving Nez Perce testimony of what the 11 days between Fort Fizzle and the Big Hole actually meant to the people who lived through them. Without McWhorter's project, that testimony would likely have entered the ground with the men and women who carried it, leaving only the Army's engagement reports and the fort's joke of a name to describe what had happened in that stretch of Montana in the summer of 1877. The oral record of the Bitterroot Passage itself, the settler accounts of trading peacefully with the same people they had mobilized against days earlier, sits in a similar position. It was never suppressed in any formal sense. No agency ordered it destroyed, no report was sealed. It simply was not the kind of material that 19th and early 20th century military historians, writing campaign narratives organized around battles, had any structural reason to elevate. A valley that did not fight does not generate casualty lists, does not require an official inquiry, does not produce the kind of documentation that survives into national archives with the weight of an official record behind it. It survived instead the way so much of this region's deeper history survives, in family letters, in local newspaper recollections written years after the fact, in the kind of testimony historians handle carefully because it cannot be cross-checked against a parallel institutional paper trail that was never generated in the first place. That absence of parallel documentation does not mean the settler accounts or the Nez Perce testimony are unreliable. It means the story was carried by exactly the kind of witnesses this account has been built around from the beginning, participants and their descendants, rather than by the institutions whose job it technically was to record it. The army documented the battles. It did not, with the same rigor, document the peace that preceded them, because peace was not what the campaign narrative needed to justify what came next. The physical trace of all this is still there for anyone willing to drive the length of it. A replica of the barricade stands today at the site the soldiers called Fort Fizzle, along with a historical marker describing the standoff in terms that lean, understandably, on the irony of its name. Woodman's Prairie, where the actual negotiation with Lookingglass and Whitebird took place, sits a few miles further west along the same creek, marked more quietly. South through the Bitterroot Valley, the towns of Stevensville and Corvallis still stand roughly where the trading took place in those 11 peaceful days, though little in the modern landscape marks that specific history. Further south and west, across the Continental Divide, the Big Hole National Battlefield preserves the site of the Dawn attack itself, its lodge sites marked in the open ground where Gibbon's men struck before light. The entire route from Lolo Pass through the Bitterroot to the Big Hole now falls along the officially designated Nez Perce National Historic Trail, which travelers today can follow through the same region tourism boards now call Glacier Country, a name that stretches to include the towering, ice-carved peaks of Glacier National Park to the north as easily as it includes the quieter valley where a promise was kept for 11 days in 1877. What the land holds in the end is not a hidden chamber or a buried structure. It is a sequence that has always been available to anyone willing to read the record in order rather than by engagement. A canyon where a fort failed without a shot fired. A valley where a promise, made under duress and against every expectation of the volunteers who received it, was kept in full. A river valley on the far side of the mountains where that same trust, extended by people who had just proven they meant what they said, was answered before dawn with rifles. The Nez Perce said they would pass through Glacier Country without violence, and for 11 days they did exactly that. What the institutions chose to remember afterward was the battle at the end of that stretch, not the peace that came before it, and the gap between those two choices is what still sits, quietly, beneath the ground the trail now crosses. The trail south from Big Hole did not end the reckoning between promise and policy. It extended it, and the next chapter of that extension unfolded across a landscape even less forgiving than the Bitterroot had been. In the days following the attack at Big Hole, the surviving Nez Perce, grieving and reduced in fighting strength, regrouped under a shared leadership that now included Chief Joseph more prominently than before, alongside Lookingglass, Whitebird, and a war leader named Poker Joe, who took on the demanding task of setting the pace of the retreat. They moved south and east through the Bannock country of what is now Idaho, then into the volcanic plateaus of the newly designated Yellowstone National Park, barely 5 years old as a federal reserve and still largely unmapped by the tourists who occasionally wandered its geyser basins that August. It is one of the stranger footnotes of the entire campaign that a band of people fleeing for their survival passed directly through a handful of vacationing parties near the Firehole River, resulting in a brief and confused series of encounters in which a few travelers were taken captive, questioned, and in most cases released within days, shaken but alive. Contemporary newspaper accounts seized on these encounters with considerably more enthusiasm than they had ever shown for the peaceful passage through the Bitterroot, in part because a captured tourist made for more vivid copy than a valley that had simply been left undisturbed. The asymmetry in what got reported again tells its own story about which parts of this flight the American public was prepared to find newsworthy. General Howard, still trailing the main body by days rather than hours, reorganized his pursuit through Yellowstone and beyond, while telegraph lines carried increasingly urgent dispatches to military posts across the northern plains. It was in this stretch that the character of the pursuit shifted from a single column chasing a fleeing band to something closer to a coordinated interception effort, with multiple commands converging from different directions. Colonel Samuel Sturgis, moving up from the south with elements of the 7th Cavalry, the same regiment that had been shattered the previous year at the Little Bighorn under Custer, attempted to cut the Nez Perce off as they emerged from the mountains near Canyon Creek in early September. The Nez Perce, reading the terrain with the same skill that had carried them over the ridge above Lolo Creek weeks earlier, slipped past Sturgis's position with only a rearguard skirmish, losing few people and considerable numbers of Sturgis's cavalry horses to a raid conducted with characteristic precision during the encounter. It was, in miniature, Fort Fizzle again, a prepared military position, a demonstrated willingness among the Nez Perce to avoid direct confrontation wherever the terrain allowed it, and an outcome that the pursuing institution would rather not dwell on in its own after-action reporting, since evading an entire regiment of cavalry a year removed from Little Bighorn was not the kind of episode that flattered anyone's competence. By late September, the Nez Perce had crossed into Montana's high plains north of the Missouri River, moving toward what they believed, with good reason, was safety. Sitting Bull and a substantial body of Lakota had crossed into Canadian territory the previous year following Little Bighorn, and word had reached the fleeing bands that the border, and whatever protection it might offer from American pursuit, was close. Poker Joe, who had been setting a grueling but sustainable pace, was overruled in the final days of the flight by leaders who believed the immediate danger had passed and the pace slowed. It was a miscalculation with consequences that would define how this entire campaign is remembered. On the 30th of September, at a place called the Bear's Paw Mountains, roughly 40 miles short of the Canadian line, Colonel Nelson Miles caught the Nez Perce encampment with a force that included elements of the 2nd and 7th Cavalry. Unlike Gibbon's assault at Big Hole, the attack at Bear's Paw was not a single dawn strike, followed by withdrawal. It became a siege, stretching across nearly a week in brutal early autumn cold, with both sides dug into positions and Miles unwilling to risk the kind of costly direct assault that had cost Custer his command the year before. During the standoff, both sides observed something closer to the negotiated restraint that had characterized Fort Fizzle than the surprise violence of Big Hole. Truce flags were exchanged. Miles himself, at one point, met face-to-face with Joseph under a flag of truce, and was reportedly struck by the dignity and clarity with which Joseph spoke of his people's exhaustion and his desire to end the suffering of the wounded, the very old, and the very young among his band, many of whom had gone without adequate food or shelter through days of freezing rain and snow, while dug into shallow pits on the open prairie. Some of the Nez Perce, including Whitebird and a portion of the band, slipped away during the siege and successfully crossed into Canada, joining Sitting Bull's exiled Lakota community and living there for years afterward, beyond the reach of American authority. Joseph did not go with them. On the 5th of October, after Miles had offered assurances, later disputed in their exact wording, much as Rawn's assurances at Fort Fizzle had been disputed, that the surviving Nez Perce would be permitted to return to their homeland in Idaho once the fighting ended, Joseph surrendered. The words attributed to him in that moment, delivered through an interpreter and later transcribed by an officer present at the scene, became the most widely quoted statement associated with the entire flight, a declaration of exhaustion, of children freezing, of old men dying, of a resolve to fight no more forever. Whether Joseph spoke those exact words in that exact form has been debated by historians for well over a century, much as the exact wording of Lookingglass's promise at Fort Fizzle has been debated. What is not disputed is that the surrender ended a running conflict that had covered well over 1,000 miles across 4 future states, fought by a band that had, by any accounting, tried repeatedly to secure peaceful passage before resorting to combat only when combat was forced upon them. The promise Miles made regarding a return to Idaho was not kept by the government that inherited responsibility for the surviving Nez Perce. Rather than being sent home, Joseph and the survivors of the flight were transported first to Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory, then further east to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, and eventually to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma, a climate and landscape entirely unlike the homeland they had fought so hard to preserve their connection to. Many died there of malaria and other illness in the years that followed, in a place they had never asked to be sent, and had been explicitly promised they would not be sent to. It would be nearly 8 years before Joseph and a portion of the survivors were permitted to return to the Pacific Northwest, and even then, not to the Wallowa homeland he had spent his life defending, but to a reservation in Washington, among a different community, still short of the promise Miles had made in the cold at Bear's Paw. The through line from Fort Fizzle to Bear's Paw is, in the end, a through line of promises. A promise kept in a canyon on Lolo Creek. A promise honored for 11 days across an undefended valley. A promise answered with a dawn attack at Big Hole. A promise made under a truce flag on a frozen prairie and only partially kept, years late and in the wrong place, by the government that made it. Each of these moments survives in the historical record with a different weight, shaped less by what actually happened than by which institution had a reason to write it down and preserve it. What the Nez Perce carried across more than 1,000 miles that year was not merely a flight from capture, it was a demonstration, offered again and again to a country not inclined to notice it, that peace could be kept by people it had already decided not to trust. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.